And now it's time for our next panel, Thriller and Suspense, moderated by Amanda Brack. Amanda is a career bookseller with over 20 years of bookstore experience. In addition to what you can read about her in the program, here are a few fun facts that are not in her bio. Amanda's favorite bookstore memory is helping Mr. Fred Rogers find a book. She took up a new hobby after retiring in 2021, roller skating, and she's not apparently injured. You're apparently doing very well with that. Her daughter is named after two fictional book characters. I'm dying to know which two. But please welcome Amanda to the stage along with her authors, Alex Finlay, Mary Kubica. Did I say that right, Mary? I was so scared I was going to screw that up as a Southerner. And Mega Miranda. Please give them a warm round of applause.
Thank you so much, Sue. My daughter's name is Samantha Temperance. If anyone can guess the book characters, that would be pretty impressive. I guess the temperance part is a little bit easy. So I would like to say, yes, it's so wonderful to be back in person for BookMania and see everyone here. I want to take a moment just to say some thank yous as well. Obviously, the Library Foundation of Martin County does great work. If you aren't already a member or you haven't donated to them, please take a look and do that because they do some really, really great programs in the community. I wanted to thank Jensen Beach High School for allowing us back to do this program again. We've been gone for 3 years, so it's really nice to be back here. Thank you to Barnes & Noble for being on site selling books so that you can purchase the books from our wonderful authors today. And a thank you to Jeanette Noe of the Martin County Library System. She is the lady that really behind the scenes works for months to put together the author panels and everything so that it brings you what you see for BookMania and these great panels. So thank you to Jeanette. So yes, as Sue said, I am Amanda Brack. I am your moderator for Thriller Suspense, and I have with me today Mega Miranda. Yes, I love Megan. Mary Kubica, I verified, and Alex Finlay. So as we get started, I do want to give a little bit of a reminder. We will take audience questions during the last 15 minutes, which can be really fun. So as we're going through some of our talk today, if you have a question that pops up, please go ahead and write down the question for us, and the ladies and gentlemen in blue will collect those and bring them up for us. So let's talk about some crime. So for each of you, and I guess let's start with you, Megan. What did you do before you were an author? How long have you been writing? And did your experience prior to being an author impact how your books are written today?
Yeah, I love that question because I feel like you can ask a room of like 100 authors and you're going to get like 100 different answers. Everyone has such an interesting path. So writing for me was my third career. I started in biotech and then I was a high school science teacher before becoming a full-time writer. But writing was always my passion. I was a huge mystery and suspense reader growing up. That's been like the one constant throughout all of my careers. But I also loved science, and I decided to pursue that first, hoping to still write on the side. But the truth is I let it go for about a decade. But when I started writing, I feel like all of these different careers influenced the types of books I wrote. I started in young adult fiction, and I was teaching high school. And they were all based on this like what if science idea that had kind of sparked the inspiration for these books that were a little bit paranormal. And so I wrote 7 young adult books, and then writing those books kind of gave rise to writing my adult suspense because I was thinking about these characters who'd been through these huge things in the past. And then at the end of the book, you know, they're 17 years old and you think, okay, well, I hope they're okay now and like gonna go about the rest of their lives. And years later, I would think about them and wonder like, how are they doing? Like, do they try and leave the past behind? Does it influence who they become? You know, does the past ultimately catch up with them? Dun, 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 because we're the crime writers. So that is pretty much the type of book I write now. It's really about how the past impacts the present and these big events that had happened in the past that then ultimately come back to haunt them.
Great.
So I was a high school history teacher before I started writing, and writing for me was just one of those, pastimes that I picked up when I was a young girl. I always loved to read, and I was probably middle school, maybe elementary school when I started writing. And I knew that I loved it right away. I would love to come home after school, and we had an electric typewriter back in the day, and so plug in the typewriter and work on whatever story I had going on at the time. But I was always very private about my writing. Like it never crossed my mind, at the time at least, that I would ever want to be an author, that I would want to put my work out there for somebody else to read. It was just, I love to create these fictional characters and worlds and sort of live vicariously through these characters. So I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher, though. That, at the time was kind of my greatest passion. And but again, I was always writing. When I was in school myself, when I was in college, even when I started teaching, I was always writing whenever I had some free time. And then when my daughter was born, she's 17 now, so this was back in 2005. That was when I left teaching for what I thought was temporarily to raise my family, and it was then that I started really pursuing my writing and thought about, seeing if I could get something published and making a career out of it. So it was definitely a second career for me. But I think that teaching high school kids just sort of allowed me to just constantly observe people, human nature, and just, I can't say that anything, that happened inside the classroom is like a direct inspiration for anything that's in my books. But I think that I've always just been observant of people, and I do so now if I'm writing at a coffee shop or I'm at the airport. I'm always just watching people and overhearing these conversations and seeing what can kind of add. So be careful what you say around me. Seeing what can kind of I can bring it to my books and things like that.
Yes, I have been a lawyer for nearly 30 years, and so that definitely influenced my fiction writing. I'm an appellate lawyer, and that's basically a paper fight, and a case comes to me after it's been through the ringer of the civil or criminal justice system, and you basically get this mass of this stuff that happened, and my job's to condense it down and tell my client's story in a way that's compelling to a judge. And so all of those things I think were a good training ground for me. Judges have just stacks and stacks of legal briefs, and I learned early in my career, if you want them to pay attention to yours, you better make that brief interesting, you better make it move along fast, and you better keep it as brief as you can. And for thrillers, that kind of helps. I want the readers to turn the page. I always strive in my novels, like I do in my law career, which is to say as much as I can with as few words as possible. And with fiction, you can do that. And the great thing about this job is I can just give a reader a detail, if it's just the right detail, and they fill in the rest with their imaginations. And so for every person who reads one of my books, it's kind of this interaction between me and them. And it really goes back to keeping things lean. And so that part, and the other part of being a lawyer is when I write a legal brief, the first thing that in a legal brief you have is the facts section, which is what happened, and then you have the law. My goal has been that facts section, by the time the judge is done with it, they've already decided that my client's going to win. And when they get to the law, that'll work itself out. And that's really, I learned to do that. You have to learn about storytelling. And so that's what I've integrated into my work.
So Alex writes the most compelling appellate briefs in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, let's not get crazy. I don't think you're going to want to read them at your nightstand, but comparatively, by comparison.
Comparative, hey, that works. That's wonderful. So one of the things when you write crime fiction, or you're lumped into the category of mystery, thriller, and suspense, is that can be difficult for a customer or an audience member to really gauge, is this book going to be something I'm going to be safe picking up? Am I going to read something that's going to be like, oh no, I'm going to have nightmares now? So will each of you give me an idea of where your books kind of rank on a drama, suspense, or even gore scale? Maybe from like Nancy Drew and the Clue Crew to like the kids from It chasing down an interstellar, child-eating demon. Whoever wants to go first, just to give the audience an idea of what type of thrillers you really write and what they will experience in there.
Yeah, I think I put mine somewhere in the middle of Nancy Drew and It. I definitely, I'm drawn to the psychology of the mysteries, why someone did something, and so there is some gore, there are some trigger warnings for some of my books, but I would say I try not to make anything too gory. You know, that doesn't interest me as much as just really getting inside somebody's mind and figuring out, you know, what motivates them to do the things that they do.
Yeah, I'd say very much similar for myself. I'm actually like a huge chicken in real life. Like I can't watch scary movies. Like the jump scare is the thing that I have to have someone, like there's movies I want to see and someone has to basically walk me through the entire plot before I can go see it. So I'm really very much interested in the same, like the psychological aspect. Even though I think my most recent book has like a high body count in the past, they're not like things you see on the page. It's more about the aftermath and working through what happened and why. So I'd say they're pretty much in the middle, very similar to Mary's.
Yeah, speaking of the jump scare, my wife the other night had a jump scare. She had a glass of wine in her hand and threw it, the whole thing across the room. So, just an aside.
Was she reading your book at the time?
I agree with everything that was said. I'm not a gore person. I think my books have crime and murder and all that. Just, you know, to be transparent about it. But I often find that, you know, it can be more spooky or frightening to what's not on the page. And things that happen off screen. My last book, The Night Shift, it opens, awful premise. It's a Blockbuster video store in 1999. All the teenage employees are attacked and only one of them survives. You don't see any of what happened. You see a couple kids go into the break room and not come out, and their teenage colleague goes to check on them, goes in there and sees two sets of legs on the floor, and then a light goes out. You didn't have to see anything there, what happened, for it to achieve the same purpose. And so I often will do things off screen, just as one, I don't particularly like to read gore myself, but it's also useful for suspense.
It's what you don't know, right? That's that suspense
Right.
element.
Absolutely. I would agree. I think, you know, even if someone doesn't read a lot of mystery and suspense, any of your novels are perfectly accessible. You're not going to run into any page where you're like, oh no, what just happened here? I didn't want to see that. So definitely great thrillers and psychological thrillers for that. So on that note, when you're at the heart of any of these mystery and thriller novels, there's going to be some kind of fateful event. So how do you find that hook? What happens that causes you to that light bulb to go off and you say, okay, this is going to make a great story?
Well, I'm probably the worst to say because I never have a clear answer to this kind of where you get your idea or where did this come from. Occasionally, a book I'll be able to pinpoint it, but I think for me it's like ideas can come from anywhere and often unexpected places. For the current book, it's called What Have We Done? I was reading a lot of Malcolm Gladwell, which he's a nonfiction writer. If you've read his work, he takes social science and he kind of combines it with profiles, and it's really storytelling, but he addresses really interesting questions about, you know, how we communicate with each other or what makes somebody successful. And so I was on a kick of reading all of his books, and he touches in some of them on this phenomena where sometimes the things that you think are going to hold somebody back, the trauma, the different things that happen to them, could be the catalyst for them to become really successful. And sometimes people who have every advantage in the world, at some point, you get a certain level of advantage and it starts to hurt you and make you less likely to be successful. And as part of that analysis, he said, you know, he noted some studies have noticed that people who lost a parent at a young age, there's a disproportionate number of them who have really achieved. If you take US presidents, about a third of them have lost a parent at a young age. And so that got the seed of this idea for my book, which is about a group of foster kids who lost their parents, who are at this kind of abusive foster home. And the place is shut down, they're the best of friends, and they go on to have these really accomplished lives. And then somebody shows up out of the blue trying to kill each one of them, and they have to reunite. But the genesis of that idea was this thing about what happens to us when we're younger, or losing a parent, or that type of thing, how it can affect us later. And all of my characters are they're really successful and they have interesting jobs, but they carry the baggage of what happened. And in the book, they have to go back and face that to, you know, kind of determine who wants to kill them.
So a lot of times they talk about writers as either plotters or pantsers, and I think Megan and I are very similar in that we're both pantsers. In other words, we fly by the seat of our pants. We don't plot anything out. So whenever I get an idea, when it first comes to me, it's just like this tiny, tiny seed of an idea. It's not fully formed. Sometimes I don't know if it's going to have legs, and it takes time to start writing and developing that story to see if it's going to go anywhere. But usually it's just something, that maybe I either just, think up, or I see something on the news that inspires me, or I listen to some true crime podcasts, things like that, just some little bit of inspiration. And, I don't know at the starting point really who all my characters are going to be. I don't have any idea how the story is going to develop. I definitely don't know what my twist is going to be. But with my last book, just The Nicest Couple, the idea that first came to me was just the idea about a missing man. Because I feel like we hear so often in literature and in real life about missing women and missing wives. And so I started with that idea, wouldn't it be interesting to explore a story of a missing man and see if ultimately, the story is the same as when we hear about missing women, or if there's something different, if it develops differently. So that was it. It was just kind of that spark of an idea. And I started writing, and little by little got to know my characters and saw where the idea led. But so it always just kind of comes as a little nugget.
Yeah. Very similar answer for myself. For the most part, I usually don't have like the big high concept like plot element at the start. It's something small that turns into something bigger, or it's two different ideas merge, or I see something on the news and it kind of triggers something else I'm thinking about. And usually it starts with a character where it's like a character who, and then the plot develops from there. I kind of write my way into the story. My most recent book, The Only Survivors, though, this is one I actually started with a plot point, and it was really unusual for me to actually have a plot before everything else. And it actually happened, I was on vacation with my family. We were visiting my husband's family in Puerto Rico, and my husband and daughter were walking along the beach, and a cell phone washed up at their feet in the surf. It just appeared. It was in one of those OtterBox cases, but it was cracked, and it looked like it was dead, and they were like, well, let's bring it back to our condo and see if we can track down its owner. And I was like, well, this is a hopeless situation. We left it out in the sun. We came back at the end of the day, and my daughter had gotten back first. She's like, plugged it in, and it turned on. And I was like, and she's, and there's no password screen. Where I'm like, that's crazy. That would never happen. And immediately they were like, well, this is exciting. We're going to track down the owner. And the crime writer in me was like, absolutely not. Clearly, this is evidence of a crime, and we have just turned on the phone, and now they can track us down. And they were like, why do you think that way? But I guess it's useful when you're writing crime fiction, but not existing in daily life. But that is what my mind does. It takes a piece and just runs with it. And the story had a very happy ending where we did track down the owner. It was it took a long time, but they had lost it on vacation 2 weeks earlier, and it had survived somehow, which blew my mind. Sent it back to them, but in the back of my mind I was like, is this really the story? And I got home, and if you read The Only Survivors, this is a very small plot point, but it was the element that kind of, I was like, okay, so who's at the beach? What's this group of people? And in my case, I'm like, okay, it's not family, it's not friends, it's a group of classmates who've survived something tragic and come back together. And so my husband always jokes I take these our favorite places and then turn them creepy, so that's apparently my brand. The beach, creepy now. Yeah.
Yeah, she does a great job with the cell phone. I've gotten to read the book because I got to do the panel, so yeah, definitely the cell phone.
I think I see the cell phone guy out there watching you right now. Some guy was
I was also thinking you could kind of pitch that to that cell phone company, because that would be a great story for a commercial,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Alex, I want to touch on that, because didn't you turn a place creepy? You take your wife on a research.
well, there's so many things where I can go with that. I don't know which one you're referring to. I had a recent research trip where in the current book, the kids I talked about who grow up to be successful adults, one of them is a TV producer for a reality TV show, and I'm kind of lazy. My buddy is the producer for this show called Gold Rush, so I just basically stole his job and kind of fictionalized it. But they follow these coal miners around. And so I wrote the book. As usual, I didn't do any research. I just wrote the thing, and then I always go back and have to fix things at the end. And I thought, coal mining, I go into this coal mine, stuff happens, and that's a tricky job and dangerous, and I should probably respect that and do the research on that, not do what I often do, which is just kind of fake my way through it. So I contacted the University of West Virginia, has this great coal mining safety program where they have this great mock mine, and they train people how to rescue people, and they do these simulations. But it was during the pandemic, and the only time they could get me in was on my 30th wedding anniversary. So you see where this is headed. And so there we go, my wife and I. It was pandemic, so we go to this small town. Nothing's open on the main street. I think we were the only people in the hotel. We had like cold Taco Bell for our anniversary dinner, which it wasn't nearly as romantic as I'm making it sound either. And so we go and we do the research trip, and it turned out well. But so that's I usually listen to the audiobook of my book right before it comes out, so I can refresh my memory. My wife and I were driving, listening to it, and I swear every time the coal mine scene comes on, her jaw clenches just a little bit, just a little.
So I expect your 35th anniversary, your book's going to take place near Paris.
If we get there, if she hasn't rethought the whole thing.
So you mentioned writing a book in quarantine. How were you guys doing? Were any of your books conceptualized in quarantine? Did that incubate any of your ideas? Did it help? Did it hinder? Talk a little bit about that. Anyone that wants to or not. We can move past it.
I wrote my book that just came out in January, Just the Nicest Couple. I wrote that during quarantine. I started it. It was like April of 2020. I started it, and it was a terrible experience. I'm not gonna lie. I had never dealt with writer's block like I dealt with that book, but I had 2 kids, at home doing virtual school for almost a year. My husband working from home for about a year, and I'm the kind of writer that I want quiet. I want to be alone when I write, and I couldn't find that anywhere, and the coffee shops were closed, just everything was closed, the library was closed, there was nowhere that I could go to get that quiet that I wanted so badly to write, and so I struggled, and it was just such a different experience than I had ever had before, especially I have to say coming off the book before, it was the easiest I think that I'd ever written, so on the heels of that, to then go into this book that, when I start, I always have to turn in a proposal to my editor, and I sent her so many, I lost count of how many proposals I sent her before the one for Just the Nicest Couple, and she liked them, she was on board, I'd start writing, and I'd get like a third of the way into a book just to realize I wasn't feeling it, I wasn't connecting with the story or the characters, and I'd set it aside and move on to the next one, and I think it was just, the time and the situation, I just couldn't connect with any of these stories. And in my whole life, I've never missed a deadline. I'm always that writer that's turning in my manuscripts like months before they're due. And I watched my deadline come and go with that book, and I was still spinning in circles. I had no idea what to do, and it was like 6 weeks past my deadline. And thankfully, I had a very understanding editor. But I was about 6 weeks past my deadline when I got the actual idea for Just the Nicest Couple. And, as soon as I started writing, I connected and I fell in love with those characters, and I knew that this was finally something that I could see all the way through, and I ended up writing a draft of it in just about 3 months. I think that once I finally got going, it was just such a relief to be able to write again and not feel so, just really be struggling as much. So it was great to get past that, and I've now turned in a draft of my next book, so it was so good to know that was a one-off and not predictive of my future. But so it was just a different experience than I never had before.
So not this book, but the book that I started right before lockdown was Such a Quiet Place, which is like a neighborhood thriller, and it became almost like a lockbox, like it basically just takes place on this one street in the neighborhood. I started it, and then everything came to a grinding halt. I'm used to working at home, not used to everyone else being at home as well, and my kids doing homeschool luckily they're teenagers, they're able to do a lot, but it was very hard, I think, to kind of get deep into this mindset of a fictional world with everything else that was happening, and I also blew that deadline. But when I got back to writing it, I think the themes, I think people who've read the book think that I conceptualized it during quarantine because it is very much like you're not leaving your neighborhood. Like your neighbors are your whole world and everything is taking place there. So I feel like those themes pulled even tighter as I was writing it, and it came much more of a locked box. And then right after that, I started writing The Last to Vanish, which is set in the mountains of North Carolina. And it's about a series of people who've gone missing hiking. And like that was like, again, one of the things my husband's like, you turned something fun that we do into something totally creepy. But it was like the one thing that we were able to do was like we could get out, we could go hiking, we could go walking. And I do feel like that very much inspired that book. And so even though it's not kind of pulling on those like quarantine themes, it is inspired by, I think, what we were doing when we were first kind of emerging from it.
Yeah, I didn't need the pandemic to miss every deadline, but I'll use it if I can. So I had similar. I had when the pandemic broke, I had a senior in college who had to come back his last 3 months, and I don't know if you've had somebody who's been out not under your rules for 4 years. It's a real fun time. And then my daughter was a senior in high school. She was home, and I kind of capture this whole what all that was for me. And there's my favorite ever book dedication that I should figure out what author it is, but I saw it online or something. And the dedication goes like this: "Were it not for my wife and children, this book would have been done 2 years earlier." So, but as far as the process, I actually did have some block as well. I started writing as a lawyer, going from basically my commute from my house outside of DC to downtown DC. So I would write on the way there on my phone, and I would work all day, and then on the way home I would write on my phone. And then on the weekends, I would dump all of this ramblings of a madman into a document, and that's what I would sit down to start writing. For me, it was one, something about the movement, and two, having words on a page, even if they were terrible, was just something that got me motivated to sit down and do it. And the pandemic came, and I had no commute anymore, and I'm having this kind of block. And then I realized it's because I wasn't walking anymore, so I just had to recreate my commute, and I'd go on these 3-hour walks. I'd look up, I'd be in some neighborhood I've never been in DC, because I've just been walking, writing these first drafts. And to this day, I cannot write without walking. Even if it's cold out, I'm on a treadmill. It's weird. So.
That's so interesting. That's fun. Okay, so each of you also, in the mystery and thriller genre, so many authors have recurring characters, recurring worlds that they just build upon, and each of you have chosen to do standalone novels where you start from scratch each time. So talk a little bit about that choice, and are there any of the worlds or neighborhoods that you would like to go back and revisit that we might get a sequel to?
I love reading series, but I love writing standalone, and I feel like it's probably because of my process that I love to start with a character and discover what their world is, and that's kind of the most fun for me, is what are their relationships like? What secrets are kind of buried between these relationships? And part of the unraveling of the mystery as I'm writing, there's the external plot, but it's really about the secrets, I think, that are inside other people that are what really fascinate me. And before I see a plot arc, I'll usually see a character arc and where I hope they'll get to at the end. And at the end, you're like, okay, they've made it through all of these terrible, scary things that have happened to them, and I like to imagine that they're off living their lives after that. And I do think about characters years later where I'm like, I wonder if there's a story here, but I'm a thriller writer, so I'd have to put them in another terrible situation again. And my main characters are not police officers, they're not detectives, they're not people who would have an investigative role normally, unless it's very much about normal people who find themselves at the center of this mystery. And so I think because of that, I'm naturally drawn to writing a new cast and a new standalone each time. The only time I had done a companion, my very first book was a young adult book called Fracture, and 2 years later I wrote a companion from a different character's point of view, and it was 8 months later, but you could still kind of see the same characters in it, so that was kind of fun. But then, because I'd never done it before, I was like, oh, you're so bound to everything you wrote before. You can't go back. My editing process, everything changes dramatically as I go. So I think standalones are most suited for my what I'm interested in my process.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to be totally honest, I think I have ruined all of my characters' lives so badly by the end of my books that I just have to let them go and have to let them move on. I'm the same. I had a detective in my very first book, The Good Girl, and sometimes I do think it would be fun to revisit that and have a totally different mystery, where the detective is involved, but the rest of the cast is totally different. So, it could be read as a standalone or they could go together. But I just, every time I go to start a new idea, I know that there would be some comfort, and I've talked to authors that write series about they already have their worlds, and they already have their characters, and they don't have to rebuild that from scratch. And I think that there would be some comfort in that. But there is something about that totally blank page, totally fresh ideas that always draws me to it, and just the idea of starting with nothing and getting to create it all again. So I don't know if I wouldn't say that I would never write a series, but I definitely think that I'm for the immediate future at least, drawn to standalones.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a hybrid because I did what Mary had mentioned. In my first book, Every Last Fear, there was one character, an FBI agent, and as I was working on the next book, that book came out, and readers kind of liked this character, and then the TV people wanted to do a show with her centered in this, and I thought, being the hack I am, I'm going to put her in the new book too, and so she reappears, but a totally different standalone story. And I really liked writing that character, and there was some comfort, like you said, going back to somebody you've worked with. But I agree. I don't think I could keep track of all, even just those two books, keeping track of things you did in the first book and making sure you're consistent is tricky. I don't know how Jack Reacher does it, 20 books later. I have no idea. I like to, if I would write a series, if I thought I could sustain one that I would be interested in keep writing, but I need to just go with what's interesting me at the time so I can, get what I need to do and get me in the chair and get me to write.
You guys are generating questions. This is nice. I have a couple more, and it's one of those nice things. It's something my husband is specific about, where he prefers books that are not long series. He likes to have that kind of closing at the end. And it's a really good point that you made, Megan, where you said that how many times do really bad things happen to your characters? So it completely makes sense taking that standalone type of novel when you create your characters that are fairly relatable, like normal people. So let's talk about creating your characters. How deep do you go in your character creation? Do you ever base them off of real people? What do you do the characters tend to come before the crime or the plot, or do they mold them, or does the crime mold the characters? A little bit of both. Who wants to start that one?
Yeah, I can start. I go with, I come up with the premise, and it's usually I write the prologue, and that's when I know that's the book, this is going to be the setup for the book. And then I ask myself, who would the natural people be involved in this setup, a victim or a family member or a FBI agent, whoever. And then I start kind of identifying who I think I want to tell this story, and I write multi-perspectives, so my books tend to be, you follow one person, then you jump to another, then you jump to another, and it all comes together. But for me, it's as I go. I'll know about 20 pages into a character if that character has a voice, and if I want to keep writing that character. And once I get past that point, I get to know the character as I'm doing it. And then I kind of circle back about halfway through and start to do things. I have friends who do really detailed, before they even start, they do these detailed character profiles, and they know what the character's favorite food is and their favorite music. I don't do that, but I do try and come back once I know the character and think about those things and weave in that kind of thing earlier on.
So I always start my books just with, I think, like a problem, something that needs to be solved. And then the characters come next. And like Alex, I always use multiple narrators. So the next thing, once I have that problem, I ask myself, who is going to tell this story? And I love telling them from multiple perspectives, because I think that as a reader, you just get, a more comprehensive view of the story. And I think that it adds to the suspense too, because not all those narrators might be telling you the same story, and you have to decide, who you can trust. So I asked myself who are going to be my narrators, and I almost always write from the first person point of view because I feel like I can kind of become one with that narrator that much more, because characters are just so important to me. I think in a thriller you sort of have to find that balance between plot and characters, but it's important to me that you as a reader connect with the characters on some level. Like, you don't have to like them and you don't have to agree with everything that they're doing, but it's important that you see why they're doing the things that they're doing. So I work really hard on creating authentic characters. And then I do something that I don't think, it's kind of different. It always sounds messy when I describe it, but it actually makes it so much easier for me. It really simplifies the process. So I take just one of my narrators at a time, and I write his or her story from beginning to end. And then I jump back with one of the other narrators, and I write his or whole story from beginning to end. And then I do that for however many narrators I have, and I take it, to the copy store and print out all these different documents, and sit at my kitchen table and start to shuffle it back together into a book. And so it sounds super messy, but that way I can just focus on one character, that one character's voice, so that I'm not bopping back and forth from chapter to chapter with character to character. So I'm just focused on that one person. A lot of times my books are not totally linear time-wise, so sometimes their plots are not exactly going together. So I can just keep everything that much more just really easier in my mind because I'm just focusing on one period in time and one character's point of view. And it's always so fun then to put it all back together into one book and see how it reads. There are a lot of edits at the end. Like, it can be a super messy process, but it's really fun to put it together into one book and just see how it all goes back together.
Oh, can I just add one thing? Mary doesn't know this, but I heard her at a conference when I was working on Every Last Fear, and I was struggling with how to deal with a multi-perspective book, and I just basically stole your process. I wrote the whole chapter, and that's what I do now. I was on the airplane on the way here. I had all these different little pieces I was putting together, but I really attribute it to Mary, and I wanted to mention it because it was a light bulb moment. And you get these as a writer where somebody says something and you're struggling, and they're doing something that you think, okay, I'll give that a try, and that's the only way I do them now. So.
Oh, I'm so glad that worked. Yeah, it was one of those, I found it, or I figured it out, I tried it. Really, it was out of necessity with one of my books, and there were just so many characters, and it wasn't linear, so I was different times, and I couldn't keep it all straight. And so I thought, I'm going to try it this way, and it worked. And so I'm so glad that you heard that and that worked for you, too.
I just had a light bulb moment over here, too. Like, I don't know if you saw, I was like, oh, that's how you do it. That's amazing. I'm fascinated by that. I generally write from one point of view. And I think it's because I'm naturally drawn, and I write in first person, I'm kind of naturally drawn to connecting, like Mary said, to a character. Even if I haven't had those experiences, I feel like if I can connect to an emotion, then I can write that character authentically. And I don't usually know enough about them before I start the book. Like Alex, I don't do a lot of I don't do a character sketch beforehand, but I try to know, maybe it's because we write crime, I try to know what they're afraid of. And maybe not the external plot, but what are you afraid that someone will discover about you? What are the things that you're trying to keep hidden about yourself? And I feel that the plot then almost develops in opposition to that because your character is going to have to come face to face with these things. And it helps me, so I feel like I can't develop one without the other. I could never have here's my plot idea, or I could never just have here's my character idea. They really come together to have to create a book. Usually it's character first. This last book I did have a little bit of plot first, which was different. And this book also is the first time I actually have, there's 7 survivors in this story, and it is narrated first person from one of the survivors' points of view, but there are flashback chapters from each of the survivors in third person, and they each give a little bit of what happened in the past. And that probably would have been very helpful if I had known this beforehand of how to craft that. It's really a different thing, I think, to write different characters' points of view. And also, when I first started this book, I thought, well, my editor was like, do you think the whole thing should be in third person, though? And I started it, and I wrote about 50 pages, and I was like, it's just not playing to my strengths of how I write and how I connect, and I threw it out and started again. And you just have to, I feel like everyone has a process and a way of connecting to characters, and mine is writing from that headspace and trying to immerse myself as much as I can into what they would do and why.
Beautiful. All right, well, we have about 15 to 20 minutes left, so let's segue into some audience questions. This one, pretty straightforward. Do you, for your audiobooks, get to personally pick your voice actors? Do you get a say in it? This person particularly loves the ones for Mary's books. So what does that process look like for your audiobooks?
Yeah, so my publisher will send me, for each of the narrators, they'll send me like 3 samples of work from audiobook narrators, and then I get to listen to those and choose from them. And it's always such a fun process because, you know, of course, like as the author, you have an idea in your head what these characters sound like. So you listen to these little snippets, and it's either like right on or it's totally wrong. And so I love doing that. I know my second to last book, Look a Woman Missing, the audiobook, has done very well. Readers really, or listeners, I should say, really have enjoyed it. So for my last book, Just the Nicest Couple, I right away just asked for 2 of those narrators back because I knew that people were really happy with them. But as someone who listens to a lot of audiobooks myself, I mean, I know how important that narrator is. They can really, they totally change your experience with that book. And I hate to say it, but I've turned off an audiobook before because I just couldn't connect with the narrator. And it has nothing to do with the book itself. You know, I'll still go pick up a physical copy of the book, but I just know how important that is.
Yep, same here. I usually get a couple of samples sent. I was actually really excited this time because it's my first time having more than one narrator, which was so cool to be like, it's, you know, there's like a whole cast that you pick from. So that was a really fun process this time.
That is cool.
Yeah, it's exciting.
So what authors do you enjoy reading or listening to on audiobooks when you're not writing or, you know, during that kind of break time? Who are your favorites? Them. Okay, well, obviously.
A few of my, I mean, I'm actually listening to Alex's book right now in audio. But yes, these are 2 of my favorites to read and listen to. And some others, some of my long-term, I feel like my list is constantly growing because I love so much of character-driven psychological suspense, and there's just so many great books out there right now. Some of my longtime favorites, Tana French and the Dublin Murder Squad series, and Harlan Coben is another. I always look forward to Riley Sager's books every summer, and Wendy Walker, and I feel like I can go on and on.
Yeah, I think that my list would basically be the exact same as Megan's. You know, and we've all connected with so many authors, you know, through this process and just, you know, being on panels or going to festivals with other authors. And so then you're always, I think, eager to support your fellow authors that you get to know. But, you know, the same, I got a sneak peek of Riley Sager's book, which is out this summer, and it's absolutely phenomenal. I think it's his best yet. Wendy Walker, Kimberly McCreight. I read a lot of or listen to a lot of historical fiction too. I love Kristen Hanna is one of my ultimate favorites, and Pam Jenoff.
Yeah, I mean, to Mary's point, we know a lot of the people too, so if we leave somebody out, you always feel later like you're going to have an awkward moment with them at the next conference. I'm a big, you know, obviously Mary and Megan, and there's so many that my wife's a 2 audiobook person a week, so I get what she recommends after because my time's more limited as I'm writing. But I also like to do things outside the genre. I loved Matthew McConaughey had his biography, which just having him read it, he's a great storyteller. I went in with very low expectations for some reason. I listen to a lot of biographies. I find people's lives kind of fascinating, and you often get little ideas for your books from things that have happened to other people.
Oh, right. I'm in charge here. Right, sorry. This one just came up, and it's actually a really fun question. Do you ever get creeped out from your own writing?
So I get creeped out from the research of my writing, and I think it's because, like I said, I'm a big chicken, and I feel like maybe that is why I'm drawn to writing crime fiction, because you're controlling it a little bit. Like I kind of I'm in control of the destiny of these characters a little bit. But when I'm doing the research, that is when I get really creeped out. So I was writing this young adult book, and I had pitched it as it's basically a home invasion story. I pitched it as The Science of Fear meets Panic Room. And so I was doing all this research on home invasion security protection. And then I'm home alone, like at night with my children. And I, like, in this house that is built like a fortress, like there's like a panic room. And when I'm writing this book, I became convinced. I was like, obviously I need a panic room in my house. And my husband's like, I don't, like, your neighbors are this close, like I'm pretty sure they're gonna hear you, like, help, that everyone's gonna hear you. As soon as I was finished with this book, I was like, oh, okay, no, I don't need a panic room. But the research gets into my head more than the writing itself.
Yeah, I totally agree. My last book, there's something happens, like in a forest preserve area down this path, and I'm a big runner, and it was actually modeled after a place where I like to go run. So, you know, and it was great for like writing, and I could really describe it pretty well because it's somewhere that I go run pretty frequently. But now it's hard to go back, you know, and not think of all these bad things that have happened here.
I don't get creeped out by my own writing. My daughter writes some really creepy short stories. When she was in high school, she had a creative writing class, and she'd write these kind of dark crime stories, and I was, you know, trying to encourage creativity and everything. And I'd say, but at the end, you know, put a note to your teacher, you know, that this isn't a cry for help, or, you know, your dad's a crime writer, or anything. And so one night at dinner, she says, hey, Dad, I got an A on my short story. And I said, oh, you didn't let me read that one. And then she said, yeah, my teacher said it really stayed with her. I said, all right. Next day, you know, it was Monday, I got an email from the vice principal and a call from the counselor. So I tell her if she's ever a crime writer, it'll be a great story she can tell someday.
Please submit the psychological evaluation along with... So this is a great question, and I want to add my own little question with it. When writing a book, do you always add the big twist at the end? Do you know what it will be at the beginning? And my part of this is, how many twists are too many twists? Because I read one recently that had 6. I was like, okay, I just can't anymore. Do you know your twists?
I don't know my twists. They kind of come, and I wish I did. I heard an author recently say, I can't start the book unless I know the ending, because I need to know the destination. I wish that would happen to me. It just kind of comes as I go.
I don't know my twists either. You know, I think that you need time, or I need time, I should say, to get to know the characters and their backstory and, you know, what brought them to this point in time to sort of figure out what the twist is going to be. So there's excitement with that, but there's a lot of nerves too, because of course in the back of my mind I'm panicking, like what if I never come up with a twist, or what if all these pieces never come together in some logical way. But so there's no greater feeling, I think, for me than when I do partway through, you know, writing the manuscript, come up with that twist. It's such a huge relief, and it surprises me. You know, I think that surprise is pretty authentic, and I hope that if I'm surprised by, you know, whatever these characters are up to, that you as the reader will be too. I think that there are so many incredible authors in this genre, and all the time they're getting more and more incredible authors writing amazing books, and so it is getting harder to fool readers. And so that's one of the things that's constantly in my mind, you know, well, what can I do differently when it comes to the twists? So I do play around with, like, twists on twists. I don't know how many twists is too many, but, you know, sometimes when there's a couple twists, I think it's good, because if a reader can figure out 1 or 2, but they don't, you know, get that other one, then they still feel satisfied, hopefully, when they get to the end of the book. But I have played around too with, you know, maybe the twist doesn't come on page 350, you know, but it comes on page 250, and how can we, you know, just change it up a little bit, since it is a genre that's just exploding in popularity.
I also don't ever know my twist. I love that none of us do. I feel like one of the things about writing first person is it allows me, like, as I'm writing from this character, to be like, I don't know who did it. Any one of you could have done it. And to kind of channel that suspicion towards all the characters. And I like to play with the idea that everyone can have a motive, but what's the one that's, like, pushed, like, to actually do it? And that's the surprise, or that's the reveal. And I try to think of twists as more like reveals, that they're just information, and I don't think too much about, like, the really big one. It's more like the subtle ones along the way. I feel like everything is like a shift of understanding, either for the narrator or for the reader, and that it just, like, reframes what you thought you were reading. Sometimes, like Mary, like, sometimes I know them earlier, sometimes I get halfway and I'm like, oh, I really hope that I figure out how this is going to come together at the end. Then I feel like I also channel that panic into my writing, and it helps with the suspense. I don't know. But I feel like so much of it is once I figure them out, then I go back and kind of lay all that groundwork. And you try, like, walking that line. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like that's one of the hardest part, is walking the line between, like, surprising but also laying the groundwork. Because I feel like once I put one thing in there, it's so obvious. And I have given everything away on page 13.
Right.
But I feel like I'm always building back in, because it's usually not for the reader.
Right. Well, and I think that makes it hard. You know, once we do figure out the twist, then we don't know. Is it obvious? Is the reader going to figure this out right away? And of course, that's where, you know, first readers and editors and everybody comes and hands you somebody that doesn't know where it's going, and they can, you know, put their feedback in. But I think that it's finding that balance between, you want a reader to be really sad. You know, you want them to have that aha moment at the end, not totally like, well, this twist came from out of nowhere. You want them to feel satisfied at the end. So finding that balance is part of it.
Yeah, I heard a writer once say, you know, the ending, or an editor say, the ending needs to be surprising but inevitable, and that's really hard to achieve. And we know it so well. You know, we're trying to spread breadcrumbs throughout, and when do you put that one too many that the reader's like, I know who did this, and so it's really difficult. And the way my wife now, she won't read the books until I have a full draft, because then I can have her not know what the twist is, because if she reads it going in, or she's read little chapters, she doesn't have the perspective either. So that's kind of one of the early things I do is just wait, and I don't talk about the book as much as I used to, and she's happy about that too.
Perfect. So that gives kind of a good segue here for this question. So what is the timeline for how long your first drafts normally take, and how many times do you edit?
I'd say it depends for me, honestly. I do put out, on average, a book a year. And so I feel like my first drafts generally take 6 to 8 months before I get it to the point where I feel like, okay, this is ready to go to my editor. And because I don't do a lot of plotting up front, I inevitably do a lot of editing as I go, as I figure things out. So I feel like the first 3/4 of my book is much cleaner than the last quarter when I turn it in. But I'm very interested in structure and the way stories are told. And sometimes I get that right on the first try, and that makes it a much smoother process. And sometimes I don't, and that is a huge overhaul. The Last House Guest came out a year after it was supposed to, because I just couldn't figure out the right way to tell it. I started with 2 narrators, then it was 3, then there was a 4th, and then it became 1, and then there was 2 timelines. So that, for me, is the biggest hurdle, more than the story, is who's telling the story, why, and why are they telling it in this way? And so it's kind of hard to predict. Every time I'm like, I hope this is it. But I've gotten to the point where now I send usually the first 50 pages into my editor and my agent to make sure, like, is this working? Like, just to have, like, is this general structure working for everyone?
Yeah, I have a book out maybe like every 15 months. It used to be once a year, but it's slowed down just a little bit. And I would say I typically get through a draft in maybe 7 to 8 months. And for as much as I can, I do try and edit as I write, again, because I have like these different narrators and like different documents going on. There's that merging process, which can be a little messy, and there's some heavy edits, usually when I put it all back together into one manuscript. But it's you know, the actual, it's basically clean, other than, you know, some of the plots and where they need to be moved around. But then I'll send it to my editor, and then she and I will go back and forth a couple times, probably over the next, 3 to 4 months, something like that. And that's such a great process. One, for, just her feedback, but also when she has the manuscript and I can't be working on it because I'm just waiting for her feedback, that time away from the manuscript is just, it's the best thing, because when I finally do get it back, I can look at it with fresh eyes and just this renewed energy, and I have new ideas that I hadn't thought of, before I turned it into her.
We'll have to pause here because we are actually running out of time. So if we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. Please come see them in the signing line. I want to close with just a quick reminder from each of them, who they are, what your book is, and a little bit of, hey, what's it about, or why you should come by it. Start with you, Miss Megan.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much. This was wonderful, and thanks for the wonderful questions. So I write psychological suspense, usually based on something like The one sentence pitch for most of my books is like the past returns. And that's very much the case in The Only Survivors, which is about a group of former classmates who were the sole survivors of a tragic accident when they were in high school. And they get together every year on the anniversary at this house in the Outer Banks in order to keep one another safe, so they say. But their numbers have started to dwindle, and now they're down to 7, and one more has just gone missing.
Good. Yeah. I'm Mary Kubica, and like Megan, I write domestic suspense or psychological suspense. My books are all very domestic. So this one, Just the Nicest Couple, is my latest, and it's about a missing man and his wife's, desperate search to find him, but also about another couple, the woman in that marriage who was the last to actually see this man before he went missing. And so they are hiding some secrets that they're desperate not to let anybody else find. So while one woman is searching for her missing husband, another couple is desperate to prevent the truth from coming out.
Okay, my pitch, I've already mentioned what the book, What Have We Done, is about. And my thrillers tend to be, standalones, but they involve family and past coming back to haunt you type themes. And other pitch, I have 2 kids in college. Books are right over there.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you across the way.